Welcome in, everyone. Today we're diving deep into Patrick Lencioni's The Motive. Have you heard of this one?
Oh, yeah. It's a classic for a reason.
It's not your typical dry business book, though, right?
Yeah.
It's a fable.
Exactly. And Lencioni's so good at weaving these deep leadership ideas into a story that really grabs you.
You get so caught up in the characters and the plot that you almost forget you're learning some pretty profound stuff.
It's sneaky in the best way possible.
Like a healthy smoothie that tastes amazing.
Totally. So what's the big question this book tackles?
It's all about why so many leaders seem to miss the mark on their most important responsibilities. They get caught up in the wrong things.
I think we've all worked for someone like that at some point, or maybe even been that person ourselves.
Oof, too close to home. But Lencioni doesn't just point fingers. He actually lays out two primary motives for leading. And you quickly see why one is way more effective and fulfilling than the other.
So it's not just about good leaders versus bad leaders. It's about understanding the underlying motivations that drive our actions.
Exactly. And the book does such a great job of illustrating this through the story of these two CEOs.
Shay Davis and Liam Alcott.
You got it. Shay's running Golden Gate Security. He's totally stressed out, overwhelmed, feels like he's drowning.
Classic case of the leader who's lost sight of what really matters.
And then there's Liam. He's the CEO of Del Mar Alarm. And he seems to be just crushing it effortlessly.
Which makes Shay even more insecure and intimidated.
Oh, yeah. Lencioni really nails that dynamic. Shay's initial reaction to Liam is almost comical, like he's this mythical creature he can't even comprehend.
He's practically begging his wife to give him a chore so he can get out of meeting Liam. Like anything to avoid that comparison.
It's so relatable, though, right?
Yeah.
We've all felt that twinge of insecurity when we compare ourselves to someone who seems to have it all figured out.
Absolutely. But then Liam does something totally unexpected. He offers to help Shay.
I know. It's like, wait, you're my competitor. Why are you being so nice?
Because Liam's not driven by ego or the need to prove himself. He's operating from a completely different place.
And that's where he starts to break down Shay's assumptions about what a CEO should be doing.
He introduces this idea of the chief executing officer, emphasis on the executing part.
Not just sitting in your fancy office and delegating everything.
Exactly. It's about being in the trenches,
Yeah.
making things happen.
Of course, Shay pushes back at first. I've got so much on my plate, he says.
Don't we all feel that way sometimes, though?
For sure. But I think that's exactly what Lencioni's getting at. Shay's so busy trying to look important that he's missing the point entirely.
He's confusing the trappings of leadership with the actual work of leadership.
Right. Meanwhile, Liam's totally focused. His number one priority, managing my executives.
He even makes Shay do this exercise where he ranks his tasks by how much he enjoys them versus how important they are.
And the results are pretty eye-opening, right?
Totally. Shay realizes that he's spending way too much time on things he enjoys, but that aren't actually moving the needle for the company.
There's this great little detail in that scene, too. Shay, the English major, actually corrects Liam's grammar.
I love that. It's such a perfect little illustration of their contrasting personalities.
Shay's all about the details, while Liam is focused on the big picture results.
And it reinforces this big idea. Effective leadership isn't about being polished or eloquent. It's about getting things done.
That really hits home when we learn about Liam's past. He actually failed as a CEO in London.
Yeah, that story adds so much weight to his advice. You realize he's not just some guru who's always had it easy. He's been through the ringer.
He's learned from his mistakes and come out stronger on the other side.
Which gives him the credibility to challenge Shay's assumptions.
So this leads us to Liam's central argument, that so-called reward-centered leaders consistently fail in 5 crucial areas.
These aren't the only responsibilities of leadership, of course, but they're the ones that tend to get neglected when the focus is on personal gain.
And Lencioni brings these failures to life with some pretty shocking real-world examples.
The first one, developing the leadership team. This is something so many leaders just punt to HR or worse, ignore completely.
Like it's some touchy-feely nonsense that's beneath them.
But Liam argues that it's actually one of the most critical responsibilities of a leader.
He paints this picture of a CEO sitting in a meeting, and one of his executives is literally asleep.
I know. Can you imagine? But it happens more often than you might think.
That image is so powerful because it forces you to ask yourself, would I let that slide?
If the answer is no, then you're already starting to think like a responsibility-centered leader.
Okay. What's the second omission?
Managing subordinates and making sure they're managing their teams effectively.
This isn't about micromanaging, though, right?
No, it's about providing guidance and support, making sure your people have what they need to succeed.
Lencioni shares this crazy anecdote about a CIO who found out he was being replaced through a company-wide email.
Can you imagine? How demoralizing would that be?
Talk about a lack of respect for your employees.
It's a perfect example of how ignoring your direct reports can create a toxic culture.
And nobody wins in that kind of environment.
Yeah.
So, difficult conversations.
Yes.
That's number 3, right?
You got it. This is where Liam's idea of leadership being the most painful job really comes into focus.
Because it means having those tough conversations that nobody wants to have.
Confronting an employee about their performance, giving someone difficult feedback, those are never easy things to do.
But Liam argues that avoiding those conversations is actually selfish. It hurts the employee and the company in the long run.
He contrasts this with Alan Mullally's approach at Ford, what he called joyful accountability.
Joyful accountability. That sounds almost like an oxymoron.
Right. But Mullally basically said, look, you can choose to change or you can choose to leave, but this behavior isn't acceptable here.
It's about being direct and honest,
Yeah.
but also compassionate.
Exactly. And Lencioni gives us these almost comical examples of what happens when leaders don't have those tough conversations.
Like the HR generalist who gets tasked with confronting a colleague who smells bad.
Even her boss wouldn't do it. It's a reminder that these seemingly small issues can create huge problems if they're not addressed.
Okay. What about number 4?
Running great team meetings. I think we've all been victims of this one.
Oh, for sure. Death by PowerPoint.
But Liam argues that bad meetings at the top create a ripple effect throughout the entire organization.
It sets the tone for how work gets done, how decisions are made, how people treat each other.
Lencioni describes the CEO who literally reads the sports page during meetings.
Ouch, I've definitely seen that happen. It's basically saying, I don't care about your time or your input.
So disrespectful. And finally, number 5, communicating constantly and repetitively.
That sounds a bit boring.
I know. But Lencioni reframes repetition as the CEO's duty as chief reminding officer.
It's about driving home those key messages so they actually sink in.
He contrasts this with the CEO who's always chasing the next shiny, entertaining presentation, but never actually says anything of substance.
It's not about being flashy or entertaining. It's about being clear, consistent, and relentless in your communication.
So all of this brings us back to Lencioni's central point. The motive behind your leadership really matters.
It's not about being a bad person. It's about understanding the true nature of the role and embracing the responsibility to serve others.
And just when we think we've got it all figured out, Lencioni throws us a curveball with a plot twist that perfectly illustrates the difference between these two types of leaders.
I'm on the edge of my seat. What happens?
Shay's company ends up acquiring Liam's company.
Whoa! So he wins in the end.
Not so fast. Guess who becomes CEO of the combined entity, Liam?
No way. But his company was acquired.
Exactly. But he's the better leader, even though on paper it looks like Shay is the one who came out on top.
That's such a powerful message. It's not about the titles or the trappings. It's about the substance, the motive.
And ultimately the results.
So what does this all mean for us? The regular folks who are just trying to do our best as leaders.
I think the key takeaway is that we all have a choice. We can choose to lead from a place of reward or a place of responsibility.
And understanding those 5 key areas where reward-centered leaders tend to fall short is a great place to start.
Developing the leadership team, managing subordinates, having difficult conversations, running effective meetings, and communicating constantly and repetitively.
If we can focus on those areas and make a conscious effort to lead from a place of service, we can make a real difference, not just in our own lives, but in the lives of the people we lead.
It's not always easy, but it's definitely worth it.
That's a great place to wrap up part 1 of our deep dive into the motive.
In part 2, we'll explore how Lencioni challenges some common assumptions about what makes a good leader and how even seemingly harmless motives can derail a team.
Stay tuned.
Okay, so we've talked about those reward-centered leaders, the ones who are clearly in it for themselves, the power, the perks, the glory.
But Lencioni throws us a bit of a curveball here. He argues that it's not just those attention-seeking, ego-driven leaders we need to watch out for.
Right, there's this whole other category of reward-centered leaders who are actually quite dangerous because they can be harder to spot.
You mean the ones who aren't necessarily power-hungry, but they still prioritize their own needs above the needs of the team?
Exactly. These are the leaders who are all about making work fun.
So on the surface, they seem like pretty good leaders. They want everyone to be happy. They're always up for a team-building exercise.
But Lencioni argues that this fun-centered leadership can be just as detrimental as the more overtly self-serving kind.
Why is that?
Because it's still ultimately about the leader's own enjoyment.
Hmm.
It's not about what's best for the team or the organization as a whole.
So even if their intentions are good, they're still not truly serving the people they lead.
Exactly. And Lencioni admits that he's fallen into this trap himself at times.
Really? So even someone who's dedicated his career to studying leadership can get caught up in this.
It just shows how subtle and insidious this kind of reward-centered leadership can be.
So what are some signs that you might be slipping into this fun-centered leadership trap?
One red flag is consistently avoiding difficult conversations or decisions.
Like if you're always putting off that performance review because you don't want to have to give someone negative feedback.
Or if you're always delegating the tough tasks to other people because you don't want to deal with the conflict.
Basically, if you're always choosing the path of least resistance, the one that feels good for you in the moment.
That's a sign that you might be prioritizing your own comfort over what's best for the team.
Okay. What else?
Another sign is constantly seeking validation or praise for your efforts.
So if you're always fishing for compliments or trying to be the most popular person in the room.
That could be an indication that you're more concerned with your own image than with the actual results you're achieving.
Like you're more focused on being liked than on being effective.
Exactly. And that's where having a strong sense of purpose and values comes in.
If you know why you're doing what you're doing, and if you're clear about your values, it's easier to make those tough choices, even when they're not fun.
It's about being grounded in something bigger than yourself, something that gives you the strength to do what's right, even when it's hard.
So how do you know if you're truly leading from a place of service, or if you're just telling yourself that you are?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
I think one way is to ask yourself,
Yeah.
am I willing to do the things that nobody else wants to do?
The things that might not be fun or glamorous, but that are absolutely essential for the team's success.
Like having those difficult conversations, or making those tough decisions, or just being the person who's willing to listen when someone needs to vent.
It's about being willing to put the needs of others ahead of your own.
And recognizing that sometimes the most rewarding experiences come from pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone.
It's not always easy, but it's definitely worth it.
So how do we create a culture where this kind of responsibility-centered leadership is the norm, not the exception?
I think it starts with each of us being willing to challenge those reward-centered behaviors, both in ourselves and in others.
So we need to be willing to call each other out when we see someone slipping into those old patterns.
Exactly. And it's not about being judgmental or punitive. It's about creating a culture of accountability and support.
It's about helping each other to become the best leaders we can be.
And I think it's also about recognizing that leadership is not just about those who hold formal leadership positions.
Right, everyone has the potential to lead, regardless of their title or role.
It's about being willing to step up and take ownership, even when it's not expected of you.
So what would the world look like if everyone led with this sense of responsibility and service?
That's a powerful question. Lencioni paints a pretty bleak picture of what happens when reward-centered leadership becomes the dominant model.
Companies struggle. Employees become disengaged. Society as a whole starts to lose hope.
It's a slippery slope,
Yeah.
but it doesn't have to be that way.
If we can shift the focus from individual gain to collective good, we can create a world where leadership is about making a positive impact, not just about climbing the ladder of success.
It's about serving others, not just ourselves.
And ultimately, it's about creating a legacy that we can be proud of.
So as we wrap up part 2 of our deep dive into the motive, I want to leave you with this thought. What kind of leader do you want to be?
What kind of impact do you want to have on the world?
It's a question worth pondering.
In part 3, we'll explore some practical steps you can take to cultivate a more responsibility-centered approach to leadership in your own life and work. Okay, so we've talked about the two motives of leadership: reward-centered versus responsibility-centered. And we've explored those 5 areas where reward-centered leaders tend to fall short. But now I think we need to get practical. What can we actually do to cultivate a more responsibility-centered approach in our own lives?
That's the million-dollar question, right? It's one thing to understand the concepts, but how do we actually put them into practice?
Lencioni doesn't just leave us hanging. He actually offers some concrete advice on how to make that shift.
And it all starts with a simple but profound question. What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind?
That's a good one. Are you content with just enjoying the perks of leadership, or are you driven by something bigger, something more meaningful?
It's about recognizing that leadership isn't just a title or a position. It's a responsibility. And that responsibility extends far beyond the walls of your company.
It's about how you show up in your community,
In
your family, in the world.
Lencioni talks about this idea of doing the job, not just having the job.
It's about embracing the executing part of being a chief executing officer.
And that often means doing the things that other people shy away from.
The tough conversations, the difficult decisions, the unglamorous tasks.
It's about putting the needs of others ahead of your own comfort and convenience.
So where do we start? How do we actually make this shift from reward-centered to responsibility-centered leadership?
I think a good starting point is to go back to those 5 omissions we discussed earlier.
Developing the leadership team, managing subordinates, having difficult conversations, running effective meetings, communicating constantly and repetitively.
Ask yourself, where am I falling short? Which of these areas am I neglecting?
Once you've identified your weaknesses, you can start to create a plan for improvement.
It might be as simple as scheduling regular one-on-one meetings with your team or committing to having those tough conversations that you've been putting off.
Don't try to do everything at once. Just focus on making small, incremental changes.
Consistency is key. Even small actions can have a big impact over time.
I think it's also important to remember that this isn't about becoming a perfect leader.
There's no such thing.
It's about being aware of your motives and making a conscious effort to align your actions with your values.
It's about striving to be the best leader you can be, even when it's hard.
Lencioni talks about this idea of creating a ripple effect of positive change.
When you lead from a place of responsibility and service, it inspires others to do the same.
It's about creating a culture where everyone feels empowered to step up and make a difference.
And that's how we create real, lasting change, not just in our organizations, but in the world as a whole.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the motive, I want to leave you with a final thought. What would the world look like if everyone led with a sense of responsibility and service?
It's a powerful question to consider. It's a vision worth striving for.
Thanks for joining us.